All right, so this is 11 the honors. We're finishing up some notes about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So the entire system of repression and respectability of British society. Presbyterianism. We actually currently Presbyterians. A form of Calvinism places emphasis on the natural depravity of man and doctrine of predestination. I don't know what you think about those things, but my reading of Scripture and study, you can't avoid either one of those things if you take the Bible seriously. So I don't know why. It's not just Calvinism or Presbyterians that believe that. Any Bible scholar would have to believe that. Just a regular person who reads the Bible, who's a believer, understands that those two things are true. Now, there are debate as to what predestination actually means. The problem is this. Members believe that wealth is a sign of God's grace. That has never been a sign, except rarely in the Old Testament, of God's grace. Just because you're wealthy or poor doesn't mean you're lacking God's grace, and if you're wealthy doesn't mean that you are. That would be a problem. What do you know about Jack the Ripper?
Killed women.
What kind of women? That's a terrible way to put it, but they did usually have a particular occupation.
They were prostitutes.
Yeah, many of them were prostitutes. Why do they think he's a doctor?
Because he was very, his cuts were very, clean.
Right, and he may have dismembered. I don't like that term personally. Dismembered. I don't like the thought of that. But to this day, that no one is absolutely sure who he was. So it sounded like he got away with it. Of course, we don't know who it was, and maybe he didn't get away with it. You know, he just didn't know he was the Ripper. This story was published 2 years before Jack the Ripper began his dirty deeds. This story isn't nearly as heinous as the real story of Jack the Ripper. But some people claim that it was sort of a motivation, you know what I mean? It just sort of, it planted these seeds in people's minds. So whoever Ripper was, he was thought to be a respectable person like Jekyll, possibly a physician. So that's also an interesting connection, the fact that Jack the Ripper, whoever he was, like you say, he was probably a medical doctor. And Jekyll also has some shady things going on around him. He is a medical doctor, right? Are we good, Isabella? Influences. Jekyll and Hyde may have been the first story to depict a modern serial killer. Now, Hyde, we only know of three murders in the book by Hyde. So anyway, that's enough to make you a serial killer. Stevenson's stories came before Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes story. Did you know that Arthur Conan Doyle, I think, was a doctor, or at least took medical classes? I don't know if he became a doctor. And the whole idea of Sherlock Holmes being such a detective, you know, he could look at you and tell you your life story by just looking at you. Arthur Conan Doyle's medical professor had a medical professor who did that. He put on these shows with people coming in that he didn't know, and you know, looking at the power of observation is the point. Is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde a work of high philosophical intention, or simply the ingenious and irresponsible of fictions? Henry James was a contemporary of Stevenson, and a lot of people thought it was like terrible because it planted seeds in people's minds. We are so beyond that, you know. We're in an era with no subtlety at all in those areas. So some people think it had mixed response is when it came out.
Yeah. Maybe we should let us do it at the beginning of this.
And this may have been it, so let me think. Are you good? Delaney, are you good? Yes. So, what we're gonna do today, and I think I've got something for you to read. You got Wednesday, and then Thursday, I'm gonna ask you to read something for Thursday. The book is less than 78 pages, so it's about 70 pages long. It's not gonna take us long to read it. So, let's turn to it. My favorite chapter, since I know the story, and you know the story.
I didn't, because you spoiled it for us.
All right. My favorite chapter is at the end, because we're told everything we didn't know about it. So you don't know any of that, presumably, and so you're like Utterson. Utterson is utterly left out. He's utterly confused. So we'll start there. I think the first page of a book can be very telling. And so this may seem completely mundane to you. In other words, completely unimportant or drab or dull. I want to prove otherwise here. So, Aurora, would you mind reading? We won't do this very often. It won't take us long to read the book at home. So we'll do it today. Please write in your book. It's yours. I don't think you could truly understand anything without marking it. Would you mind starting?
Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged consciousness that was never lightened by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse. Backward and sentimentally long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something immensely human, but taken from his eye, something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was astir with himself.
Oh, austere means stern, strict. He's very disciplined.
Drank gin when
Gin.
he was alone, to mortify a taste of vintage, and though he enjoyed the theater, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, something wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. I incline to Cain's heresy. He used to say quaintly, and let my brother go to the devil in his own way. In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men. And to such as these, so long as they came about his chambers, he never marked a shade that changed in his demeanor.
I told you that this looks pretty common and dull, but there's some things that are important here. So look at the first couple of lines. And underline it, please. I use one of these. It's easier to spot. What is the guy like? What do you know about him?
He's cold.
He is, what does that mean he's cold? Like he has,
He's just
I-
very, to himself, and he doesn't have a smile on his face.
So
He
his
doesn't show a lot of emotion.
his personality is cold, is that what you're saying? He's not warm personality, unemotional. What can you say about him? He's rugged countenance, didn't smile, was cold, as you say. Kind of a dull person, dreary, dusty. He didn't dislike people, don't get that impression. But what was his redeeming quality at the end of that? Like what's he able to do? It doesn't sound like he liked people, but listen what it said. He had an approved tolerance for others. What does it mean? He tolerated others. And then later he said, I'll let my brother go to the devil in his own way. In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence on the lives of downgoing men. So in a way, what kind of people did he have a sympathy for? What kind of people? Downgoing men. In other words, people that were down on their luck, people that were criminals, people that he was often their last friend. And he's also tolerated others. He didn't judge other people. Now, he is not the narrator of the story, because it's not like Huck Finn was the narrator of that book, but it is through his eyes that we see most of the story. Why is this an appropriate choice to be the eyes of the story? Why is somebody who is very non-judgmental, not outgoing, particularly kind of thoughtful, maybe even dull, why is that unemotional? Why is that person, Isabella, why is that person an appropriate person to kind of follow the story from?
Maybe because he's kind of neutral.
You see, if I didn't ask you, you wouldn't have said that, and that is right. That's a really good answer. That's why I call on you, because, not just you, anybody, because you've got the answers in there. Now, can I just follow up though? Why is that important? Why is it important that he's neutral? And that's the word. That's a really good word.
Maybe because if someone was neutral, they try to turn Dr. Jekyll into the villain.
So he's not going to prejudice us one way or the other. Maybe Dr. Jekyll is a good guy, maybe he's a bad guy, but because he's the eyes of the story, he's going to let us make that decision, right? Sarah, right? He's going to let us make that decision. He's not going to influence us in advance. That word neutral. That's the word I've been looking for. All right, now he has a friend, and why don't we go to Sarah?
No doubt the feat was easy to Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at the best, and even his friendships seemed to be founded in a similar capacity of good nature. It is the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. His friends were those of his own blood, or those whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. They implied no ampness in the object. Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many, what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks, that they said nothing, looking singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all that, the two men put the greatest store by these excursions, counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business, that they might enjoy them uninterrupted.
All right, so who is Enfield? He's not an important character in the story. In fact, he drops out of the story after the first chapter, but it's important, though, for other reasons that we know him. Who is Enfield? He is a friend. How is he different from Mr. Utterson? They are opposites. He called him a man about town. He's different than Utterson. He's young. If he's a man about town, that means he has connections. He kind of enjoys. I think it suggests he is someone who socially is active. So what they don't understand is why now what is the connection? He is a kinsman, but he's not close. But why do they spend time together? I said they were opposites. What's the name of the book? Oh. All right, so you see what the author's doing to set us up here? He's putting two people together who are opposites. And what happens when you do that, by the way? Like from an artistic point of view. If you have a character and then you have another character that's the opposite, what's that gonna do for each character? Delaney? Yeah, so because they're opposites, but they are like friends or they're enemies, but you see them together a lot, what does that allow, what does that do for the book? Like Tom and Huck, in some ways, they're exact same age, they're boys, they're both orphans, but they are so different. So what does that allow? We call them character foils. One, I'm not a fashion person. I didn't have to tell you that. But what is a basic principle of fashion clothes when it comes to color?
Isabella?
When it comes to color, I mean, aren't some colors clashing, but other colors bring each other out, right? Dark and light, something like that. Right. And so that's what happens with characters. If you have a really good guy juxtaposed against a really bad guy, then his badness is highlighted in light of this guy's goodness, and vice versa. And so the name of the book is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And so you have Enfield and Utterson, who are very much like that, different. No, it is not. We're having so much fun.
This is fun.
It is fun. Wait, don't go anywhere. Not that I don't trust you, Steve, but 10:40. All right, so what are you going to read? We literally just got started. Chapter 6. There's. Why don't we do this for Thursday? No, Wednesday. Can you do it Wednesday or Thursday? Why don't we do it for Wednesday? We were reading 40 pages before. Can you read 6 to page 40? Can you read 30 pages, 34 pages? I believe you can. So read the last night is the chapter I don't want you to read. I want you to stop before you get, so that's on page 40, so it'd be through 39 in my book. So page 6 to 39.